Welcome to Pressure Points. Our topic is the NASDAQ sell-off related to concerns about how the US and China will come together on sort of a trade agreement. And I'm going to break this episode down into three pieces. First, just talked about the mechanics of what has happened more recently here today. Second is in terms of what this means for tech more broadly. And third, how I think that this will be resolved. And so going back to the top, as of this recording, the NASDAQ has fallen since the announcement about an hour ago that Trump would not be seeing President Xi in South Korea later this month. NASDAQ is down about 2.2%. At one point, it was down about 2.6%, so it has come back slightly off of its lows. If we look at the broader Mag 7, they're kind of in a similar type of down a couple percent mode. If we look at some of the smaller sub $200 billion companies, they're down more like 4 or 5%. So they're seeing more of an impact on the news, which is understandable at its most basic level. Why is tech selling off on this news is because the lack of a trade deal creates market uncertainty. Tech needs market stability to continue to move higher. That is kind of at the DNA of tech investing, is some optimism about where the world is going and that these companies can continue to grow. And to the extent that there's no trade deal, that throws a wrench in that optimism. And that's why you see this pullback. I would mention too, just in terms of the mechanics of what's going on, the fear here, of course, is that this is going to be the catalyst that ends up creating more wrenching in the market and ends up being the catalyst that bursts some form of an AI bubble. Historically, we've had 10% pullbacks. If we go back and look at 95 to 2000, we've had 11 of those 10% pullbacks. So far with the AI run, we've had a couple of those. We obviously had DeepSeek earlier in the year, and then some of the tariff concerns back in April. And so this is in some ways to be expected. In other ways, it's worth noting that there's a reasonable case that this ends up being something that festers more in the market and really throws a wrench into the AI trade. So that's kind of the setup. The second piece is in terms of what does this mean for AI more broadly? And I think at the highest level, you'd say it doesn't mean anything for AI. This is just purely that China is being more reserved in terms of their how they want to give rare earth mineral materials to the U.S. But I think kind of going below the surface, I think that there is some read in terms of what's going on between China and the U.S. and AI. And I want to go back to something that Justin Wong said on CNBC a couple of days ago when he said that China has a small lead. Excuse me, the U.S. has a small lead over China. Not a big lead, it was a small lead. It was very complimentary in terms of how China is progressing. Of course, he wants to be respectful to China. There potentially could be 20% of his business, so he doesn't want to be too negative on them. But I think that's probably a fair and reasonable read. And kind of going back to the catalyst for today, this concept that Trump is saying that they're being more difficult on their rare earth, and therefore we need to step back from the negotiation table, is that if I go and rewind back to April and May, before that there was some sort of agreement and framework in June, and go back to my conversations with former US trade officials who worked with Trump in the first administration, it was very clear that they were saying that the negotiations were around rare earth, is what the US wanted, and China wanted chips. And of course, there's been this now green light for the H20s to be sold into China. And there's been language after that green light a couple months ago that maybe China doesn't want those chips as much. Maybe they want to have their domestic chip makers to invest more in those. There's a spectrum of reasons why that might be the case. They may feel insulted by the fact that these are lower geared chips, or they may just recognize that this is really important to build a domestic, from China's perspective, a domestic AI hardware infrastructure, and they need to kind of go about it on their own. Either way you look at it, it was my understanding a few months ago, but those are the kind of the two levers. And kind of given some of the headlines over the last couple of months, I wonder if kind of that negotiation piece from the US around, we've got the chips you want, might be diminished a little bit, which has kind of slowed some of this conversation. So I want to play that forward. Let's take the case that that is in fact what's going on, is that China's less interested in the US chips. From my perspective, it doesn't change everything that's going on in AI. It may have a negative impact in terms of how NVIDIA benefits from this if their demand for the H20 and whatever future versions they have for China doesn't materialize. But the bigger picture is that AI is really important. It's important enough that it's at the center of these trade negotiations. And I think that the long-term potential and the investment cycle around it won't be diminished by any sort of orders coming for US chips to China on the GPU side. So that's the kind of the China tech side. And then the last piece, kind of how I see this play out. And at the most basic level, I come back to, I believe is an undeniable truth that people act in their own self-interest. You can always bet that someone is going to act in their best self-interest. And I think it's in the best self-interest of both companies to have a deal here. And from an economic standpoint, it's in the best interest that China and the US continue to trade at a fair rate with each other. And I think also politically, it's in the best interest of the White House to find a deal here. And why it's in the best interest is because if in fact that this trade issue lingers, it will be a negative reflection on the market. And I think pointing to a strong equity market is something that has boasted a given political party in the past. And so I think that there is motivation for the White House to see some stability and improvement in the equities. And also just, again, on the trade side, I think if you think more broadly about GDP growth for both countries, I think it's in both of their interests. So we'll get a trade deal. We'll find a way forward here. Don't know if that takes weeks. Historically, we've seen this take a few weeks and would expect this to be old news by the end of the year. On behalf of Pressure Points, I'm Gene. Bye for now.